I'm hoping the presentation, I'm going to be watching the time. It should be about 45 minutes. And it's on spring wetlands. So everyone came here for a little bit of wetland education. As many of you know, I've met several of you. I see a lot of familiar faces. I'm the land stewardship coordinator with Muskoka Conservancy, which basically means that I'm the one that gets to go out and do all the property monitoring, which is a pretty exciting summer job. The winter is more paperwork, but you got to have a little bit of both. I'm also a certified wetland evaluator. So I took the OWIS, which is the Ontario Wetland Evaluation System course about 2 years ago now. Time is flying with the current situation, 2 or 3 years ago. And that course is what allows people to identify provincially significant wetlands. So it was a week intensive course. May talk about it a little bit later. Very exciting. If you like, wading through wetlands for 5 days straight, it's a great course for you. So a little bit about Muskoka Conservancy. We're a Muskoka-based land trust, and we protect 44 properties across Muskoka, and it's somewhere around 2,700 acres now. So a pretty expansive amount of property that we protect, and there's over 500, and it's quite close to 600 acres of wetland. And that number is it's somewhat in constant flux because the acreage of wetlands can change a little bit with beaver ponds being added. And it's also that it's not always easy to access some of our properties. We have 400 acres just north of Parry Sound, not just in Parry Sound District, just north of Muskoka. And I've had to reevaluate the wetland a couple times to see exactly how much we have. So it's around 600 acres. I think we're getting quite close to that. So a lot of wetland habitat protected and a lot of different types of wetland. So about me, as I already said, I'm an avid birder and naturalist. I'm an Ontario Master Naturalist as well. I took that course as well. And what I've done in the last year is, instead of just photographing birds like I used to do, I am photographing a lot of dragonflies and butterflies and plants and a little bit of everything. So I'm gradually building up my knowledge and have become a lot more. It's very interesting to see how much there is to see when you start looking at everything as opposed to one specific group of species. As I was talking about earlier, I'm the regional coordinator for the Great Lakes Marsh Monitoring Program for the Muskoka region, as well as the Breeding Bird Atlas. And we do a little bit of stuff with the Great Lakes Marsh Monitoring Program through the Conservancy. So if you're interested in monitoring some marshes, let me know. And then, as I said, I'm a certified wetland evaluator. Just to make sure everyone can see the big slideshow, it's not like a preview screen. I had that issue once. I think it should be good. Let me know if it looks weird. So what is a wetland? And this is this is from the OS handbook. It's the standard definition they use for wetlands. And that's lands that are seasonally or permanently flooded by shallow water, as well as lands where the water table is close to the surface. In either case, the presence of abundant water has caused the formation of hydric soils and has favored the dominance of either hydrophytic or water-tolerant plants. And that's a huge, long definition that I don't expect anyone to know, because really what we're looking for is that bolded word, that plants. So right here is the key thing that you're looking for, water-tolerant plants. And that's how almost all wetlands are identified. And it's really easy to look at a pool of water and say, that's a wetland, but not all wetlands that are wet are wetlands. So I'm going to talk about how we look at an area and say that's a wetland or that's not, because there's been a couple times where I've looked on some GIS photos and I've said, wow, that's a really cool wetland. I'm going to go ground truth it. I'm going to get in there and figure out what plants and animals live there. And I get in there and it's not a wetland. It's just a seasonally inundated, it just doesn't have enough plants that we would see in wetlands. So this is a GIS photo, an aerial photo of a couple of our properties. And why I'm showing this is it's this really interesting thing to look at how to identify these wetlands. So I've been to this property, and I can tell you that all of this, save for that little lot there that someone has built on, and then down here, all the way up here, across here, all this is wetlands. And when you look at the aerial photograph, it's interesting because there's a lot of different looking parts of it, right? So we have this kind of, all these are trees in here. This is a treed wetland in there. When we're down here, we're looking at, you know, potentially shrubs or just grasses. When we're in here, I know this is all shrubby wetland. This is all speckled alder and stuff like that. So wetlands come in different shapes and sizes and different compositions. And it's very easy to look at a specific, you know, area and just say that's a wetland. But when you start looking more in depth into it, you can really start distinguishing them much easier. And then we have things like, so this is a lacustrine wetland. It's on the edge of a lake. And then when you get over to the Big East River here, you have a riverine wetland. So there's different types. We're not going to cover that because it gets into a little bit too much depth. But you can really, like, you can look at a aerial photo and say, I pretty much know what plants are going to be there before even getting there. And then you ground truth it just to be a little bit more sure. And I'm going to talk a little bit about, there's a couple pretty diagnostic plants that you can tell from aerial photography. Quick importance of wetlands. We kind of all know this. Everyone has heard about what wetlands can do, I'm sure. So, you know, wetlands are important for flood attenuation, especially in the spring. They can take up a lot of water and make sure that there's not floods just going everywhere. They're very important for wildlife habitat. A lot of species at risk use wetlands as their primary either feeding area or breeding area. They're hugely important for carbon storage, especially those bogs north of us, as well as atmospheric maintenance. So they exchange gases with the air, and they can help maintain some of that atmospheric stuff. They can take toxins out of the air, and they, you know, emit oxygen. And then they're very highly productive systems. So some of our wetlands are kind of some of the most productive systems we have. The key ones being meadow marshes and cattail marshes. So those are really productive systems. They're really important wildlife habitat. And then the other end of that, the least productive wetland is something like a bog, but that's also probably the most important carbon sink. So there's a very varied amount of importance that each ecosystem has. But I want to get a little bit into wetland types so we can figure out how to look at a wetland and say, well, I know what type of wetland that is. And if we were to look at this wetland right now, and this is a wetland, would you be able to tell me anything other than it's a wetland? I think some people would, and maybe some people wouldn't. If you want to take 2 seconds and type what type of wetland do you think? There's 4 types, well, 4 to 5 types. But this is a wetland, and it's a marsh. So this one is a open water marsh. And you can tell because there's open water. This photo was taken in May, so the lily pads and the water lilies haven't come up yet. But this is a meadow marsh. And I'm going to talk about, there's, well, 4 different types. I like to classify it as 5, but when we're looking at wetland evaluation, there's strictly 4 types. So that's a bog, a fen, swamp, and marsh. And I usually kind of say 5 because I like to break marshes into meadow marshes, which are your, you know, grassy, sedge-filled marshes, and open water marshes, which is where you're getting your emergent plants, your water lilies, your cattail, well, sometimes cattails, things like that. So marsh encompasses a wide variety of wetland, or wide variety of different types of wetlands, and is probably the most predominant one in Muskoka. So we're going to talk about each of them individually, starting with the bog. And I'm going to kind of go right down to the last point first, that most bogs in Muskoka aren't bogs. So we have quote unquote bogs, but most of them aren't actually bogs. Most of them are fens. And bogs are really characterized by raised peat hummocks. So when you get out onto a bog, it actually looks like there's hills of peat. So it's not this flat, even peat surface. It's, you know, one area of peat that's been growing for ages has, you know, created this hummock. So you're going to see it's not an even space when you're getting out on a bog. Bogs are also one of those things where if you jump up and down, you can feel the movement of the peat. So you can feel kind of the water underneath, which is a bit of a surreal feeling. Highly recommend going out on a bog, just going out with one other person. And there's less than 14 plant species. That's kind of the key thing when we're looking at the difference between a bog and a fen. Bogs, and you don't even need to be able to ID these plant species. You just need to say, those look like two different plant species. So that one's a grass and that one's a fern. So bogs are going to have less than 14. Fens, on the other hand, as I'm going to talk about, are going to have more than 14. They're going to have very few trees. Bogs have less than 25% tree cover. So when we're looking at this photo, right here, that's not a bog anymore. That's something else. This is all bog. All of that is bog. And you could probably, depending on how this looked, you could make an argument that this is bog. But these treed sections are not going to be bogs. So you can see these heavily treed sections. None of those are bogs. Those are something else. And they're ombrotrophic, which means that they depend on the atmosphere. So that's another key difference, is that bogs get all their water and nutrients from the atmosphere. There's no input. There's no groundwater input or river input or anything like that. They're getting it all from the atmosphere. So when we're looking at, you know, bogs in Muskoka, most of the time you can find inflow or outflow from the bog. Whereas as you move north, you get into actual bogs where you don't see that at all. So fen. Fens are, this one is a poor fen that we protect. And this one, you can see it's more of a fen. It's going to be more of a fen on the edge here. And if you walk this, you can see quite a bit of peat underneath this, this leather leaf here. And fens can have peat. They also sometimes don't have peat. So they're a little bit trickier to identify, but they always have more than 14 plant species, or in almost every case. So again, you're counting things that look different. So you see leather leaf, you see a fern, you see a different looking fern, you see maybe an orchid. And as soon as you count over 14, that's a fen. Again, there are also few trees. So this, obviously, this edge of the fen here with all these trees is not fen. That's actually, I think, upland forest. And they have groundwater inputs. So there is input outside of the atmosphere. So the two kind of key things that differentiate bogs and fens, and the reason why we don't have a lot of bogs in Muskoka, are bogs don't have groundwater inputs, and they have less than 14 species. And fen have more than 14 species and groundwater inputs. So that's our key differences between the two of them. And I would say 99% of bogs, quote unquote, bogs in Muskoka are actually fens. We have very few actual bogs in Muskoka. Next one is swamp. So this is a photo I took from the OS course. This is a swamp we went into. And swamps are our wooded wetlands, not always necessarily wooded as in trees, but they have woody stems. So you can see something like tall shrubs as opposed to trees. But often things like black spruce swamps, you're going to get something like that where, you know, this is a black spruce swamp, tons of black spruce, but also this boggy interior. And so you can kind of see right here what a peat hummock might look like. So you see that kind of lump, you see a lump here, you see some lumps back here. But because it's treed, we're saying that's not a bog, it's a swamp. It has more than 25% trees, very clearly, has a lot of trees on it. Swamps will also have subsurface water flow, so flow under the surface of water. And again, inputs and outputs. And when we're talking about inputs, Pam has a question about groundwater inputs. How do you tell? Not very easily. That's the answer. Usually you can see a little bit of water. So you can see some water here, which might be groundwater input. This was taken in June, end of June. So most of the water, standing water, is probably coming up. Sometimes you can see actual like seeps where it's, you know, when you get there in fall, it's wet. It's still wet somehow. And there's like at Upjohn, I've seen some seeps that are flowing into some of the wetlands. So sometimes you can look upland and see some of the seeps, but there's no easy way if you're standing on top of peat to say whether there's groundwater inputs. It's very hard to actually be able to do that. The best thing you can do is take a soil auger, which is basically just a way to get a soil sample. It's kind of like an ice auger, but it's for soil, and you can, you know, put it into the soil and pull it out and take a look at what the soil composition is. But there's no real easy way that the layperson could go out and say, yeah, this has groundwater inputs. And again, same with this, there's no easy way to look at this and say, well, I know there's subsurface water flow. Sometimes you can see where it might pop up over the surface and run a little bit. But there's no super easy way to figure that out without taking soil samples or looking at how the watershed looks. And swamps are often flooded in spring. That's another thing to note. If you're going out now, you're going to see a lot of flooded swamps. And especially about 2 weeks ago when the snow was all melted, lots of flooding there, at least within the wetlands. And then we get into our marsh. So our marshes are permanently or seasonally inundated with water. So if you're looking at an open water marsh, that's pretty much permanently inundated. You're always going to have water on an open water marsh. For meadow marshes, that's when you're going to see a difference where the water kind of disappears through the summer. So some, and I'm going to talk about this later, going in the spring is very useful sometimes because you see where the water, like maximum level of water can be. So it's going to have zones of vegetation as well. You see this zone right here, these zones, these zones. This is an open water marsh, as is kind of would be a good guess there. It's predominantly non-woody vegetation. So you're thinking cattails, you're thinking sedges, grasses, maybe broad-leafed emergent plants. So anything that's, you know, when you touch the stem, it's not wood. Floating plants you'll often see, things like water lilies. And then floating vegetation, you're not seeing it in the spring. So it's a bit trickier in the spring to say, well, that's for sure an open water marsh, because often you can't see those lily pads. And a quick question from Caroline on, does a swamp have surface water input, i.e. a stream? And this is a good one for all wetlands, except for bogs. Fens, swamps, and marshes often will have streams. So the key thing is starting to look at the plants to distinguish between those, because there are groundwater inputs for fens, but you can also sometimes see where, you know, it gets water from an adjoining lake or an adjoining river. So that's a really good question. There is surface water on every single wetland, except you're not going to see it in bogs. Again, bogs only have that atmospheric inputs. And the last wetland, which isn't a wetland, it's a quote unquote wetland, is vernal pools. And I've got a little video to play. And vernal pools are really important in the spring. So this is a lot of times what people see and think that's a wetland. Vernal pools are temporary pools of water, usually only seen in the spring. And they're critical habitat for breeding amphibians, mainly because there's no predators there. So when you're looking at this temporary pool of water, you're not going to have, you know, a lot of predators, and there's not going to be fish. There's probably not even going to be a lot of birds or anything like that. So it's a really safe place to lay eggs and have them hatch. And then after that, they move to adjoining wetlands. So I'm going to show you a video of a vernal pool on one of our properties.
This is a vernal pool, one of those quote unquote wetlands. They're very important for frog and other amphibian breeding, as they have no predators and are only seasonally wet. So often they'll breed in here and then they'll leave to the adjoining wetlands.
So the thing to remember about wetlands is identifying plants are key. So if we were to look at that vernal pool, it might be really easy to say, well, that's a swamp. There's trees in there. There's trees, there's woody vegetation. That's definitely a swamp. But you have to look at the species of tree. So you're not going to see a sugar maple in the middle of a wetland, or you're not going to see a lot. You might have one on the edge of a wetland. But if we were to look into that wetland, we'd probably find things like pine or beech or sugar maple or red maple. And none of those are wetland plants. So how do you know what wetland plants are? Well, that one you're going to have to do a little bit more study, because I have lists of wetland plants and they're very comprehensive. But there's lots of really good books that kind of go through that. But you're looking for essentially plants that can tolerate being wet for most of the year. You're looking for those water tolerant plants. And when we're looking at identifying plants in the spring, it offers some pretty useful tools for wetland identification. So when we're looking at the spring for how to identify wetland, it's very easy to find woody vegetation because nothing is leafed out yet. So it's easy to just, you know, take a quick look with your binoculars or even, you know, just your eyes, and you'll see there's woody vegetation. You can see the stems, you can see like all those woody branches coming up. So it's much easier to look at something and say that's a swamp. And sometimes it's hard to ID what species it is, but there are some pretty useful tips once you get used to, you know, that you have speckled alder in the back here. Oops, sorry, that's too high. This is all speckled alder right here. So I know that because I've been here. But yeah, speckled alder is a wetland plant. It's a wetland indicator. So you're going to look at that and say, I know that's speckled alder, so we can say this is some sort of swamp, because that's clearly a lot. When you're looking at bogs or fens, you might look for something like peat mosses. Peat or other mosses are indicative to a bog or a fen. So that's a nice, easy way to start narrowing down. You're not going to see mosses in a marsh, or not going to see much. So you see a lot of peat or a lot of mosses, you can start potentially narrowing that down to a bog or a fen. And then another really useful thing for marshes is checking for dead grasses or cattails. So when we look here, all that is dead grass. All that is dead tussock sedge. Or actually, sorry, it's Canada blue joint and tussock sedge. So both of those are wetland indicators. You can start figuring out, I mean, there's all this water running through here. If you were to walk in here, you would definitely get wet. And if you're going to walk somewhere and get wet, usually you're into something like a wetland. So spring can be pretty helpful for starting to narrow things down pretty easily. And then with, you know, summer, you can go out there and ground truth it and look at the specific species that you might be finding. So I'm going to go through some of the wetland plants pretty quickly. These are just, I picked a couple kind of fairly easy ones to take a quick look at, identify. This one being speckled alder, I talked about that earlier. That one you're going to find in a marsh, swamp, or a fen, but then you start looking at, well, how much speckled alder? Is there more than 25%? Well, it's a swamp. If there's less than 25%, well, then we have to start, you know, looking at everything else. But you're not going to find this in a bog. You just won't. So some of these, there are a couple that I'll show later that are specific to one type of wetland. Some of them are specific to one or two, and they help narrow things down. Marsh's St. John wort is another common species that we see. It's got these lovely little pink flowers here, and the leaves are opposite. So you see one leaf coming out here and one leaf coming out there. So it's kind of this whorl almost of leaves going up, so one on either side, but they're opposite, but then they kind of alternate between like directions. So it's not all one like long line of them. You can see these ones are going kind of north-south, these are going east-west, and then these lovely little pink flowers there. And you're going to find these in marshes and fens. You're not going to see them in bogs. You're not going to see them in swamps. So already you see this species and you say, well, I can already cross 2 wetlands off my list. Broadleaf cattail. This is also a marsh/swamp species, almost always marsh. But again, it's pretty easy to start figuring out whether it's a swamp because there are going to be a lot of speckled alder or woody vegetation around it. But they're quite often found in marshes and probably predominantly in marshes, but there's the occasional kind of time it sneaks into a swamp. And we all know cattails, like you can see this, cattail head right there. We kind of all know what that looks like. So I'm not going to go too much into that. And then we have roundleaf sundew. And I should have put something here for scale. This is a very small plant, maybe 10 centimeters across. It's not very big. They're found in marshes, fens, and bogs. And they have, the easiest way to identify them are these little red hairs that they have. So you can see these red hairs kind of shooting off the kind of round leaves that they have. And this is actually a carnivorous plant. So when insects land on these red hairs, they're actually trapped with kind of sugary, it's some sort of concoction. And the insects will fly in, get trapped, and then the leaf will slowly close in around them. So a really kind of interesting one. I often see them, I would say predominantly I see them in fens. So that kind of helps, you're not going to see them in a swamp. And then we have some really specific wetland plants. So these are ones that are specific to only a single type of wetland. So we got tussock sedge right here, which is a marsh-specific plant. So you can see these huge, these are quite large. They can get almost like 2 or 3 meters sometimes. And then you see these large, these are the male parts of the plant right there. These, I guess they're kind of like, they're just the heads. And they're kind of, they've got these little seed pods in them, really. So you can see these ones are ones that came this season, and these are maybe dead ones from last season. But they're a huge plant, and it's just, you can actually kind of see where the root mass is, because if you were to step on the center of the plant, it's like it feels almost like a rock in the center, because on either side it kind of drops again. So it kind of pops up and creates its own little hummock there. Then we look at something like silver maple, and silver maple is a really neat species in that you can see it from aerial photography. This one is specific to swamps. Again, it's a woody plant, so you're not going to see it in any of the other wetlands. And it has these really indented lobes there. So you see the lobes are quite kind of sharp with these indentations in them. And these are the ones, my favorite way to identify these is to look at the top of the tree, because the top of the tree looks like fingers kind of going up. The way they expand are these shoots coming up, and it looks like a group of fingers kind of coming off the top of the tree. And those are, they turn red in the fall. So you can kind of see it start red at the very top of the tree and slowly come all the way down. And the reason you can see them on aerial photography is because of these fingers. They have a really unique look when you're looking at the photography. And you can actually kind of see the fingers of the larger trees. Then we get into our fen and bog species. Rose pogonia is an orchid. So you see the kind of orchid there, it is native to Muskoka, and you find it only in fens. So you see the rose begonia, say, that's a fen. I'm in a fen right now. I have seen, there's one really interesting wetland that I walked that it was like a fen marsh swamp mix, and it was really hard to identify it, but I found rose begonia on it, and I know that only grows in fens, and it's one of our few native orchid species. So highly recommend, if you can ever, take a walk on a fen, looking for these guys, because they're gorgeous little pink flowers. And then we have dwarf bog rosemary, which is a bog specific species. There's like 2 bog specific species. There's not a lot. And this dwarf bog rosemary is actually a subspecies of bog rosemary, and bog rosemary can be found in fen and bogs. So I would say there's not a very easy way to identify a bog, but if you're seeing these little kind of pink little, I guess, bells almost, you can narrow it down to at least a fen or a bog. And as you move further north, you get more into this dwarf bog rosemary that is specific to bogs. And yes, so fens and marshes are quite trickily identified sometimes. And these ones are, as far as I know, are specific to fens. So if you have rose begonia on like things that have been classified as a marsh, it might be worth a look as to finding some of the other species on there and say, well, I have rose begonia, so I think this is a fen, and let's look at a couple other species to figure that out. So I talked about this earlier. We were looking at this PSWs, or provincially significant wetlands, and they're quite important and somewhat underevaluated in Muskoka. So PSWs are provincially significant wetland, and that's what requires the Ontario Wetland Evaluation Systems course. So you have to take the course to be able to identify them, because there's somewhat of a lengthy evaluation. So you're looking at all the different plants, all the different wetlands. But what a PSW does is it says this is provincially significant and affords it more protection from development. So it's quite important, especially south of us, and will be very important going into the future in Muskoka, because we're looking at protecting these very sensitive wetland areas. And they're often qualified due to species at risk. So species at risk are really important. We're looking at like Blanding's turtle, painted turtles, snapping turtles. You might find something like milk snake, or snake species, breeding Canada warbler, golden winged warbler. These really sensitive species that are identified as species at risk because their populations are dropping. So when you look at a PSW and you find one, you can find them, they're all, the MNRF has an online map of Ontario with all the PSWs. And if you look at all those PSWs, most of the time, it's because they're species at risk on the property or on the wetland. So the OS system has 4 components. And there are, the 4 different components are, biological, hydrological, social, and special features. So the reason I say species at risk are really important is because they're the special features. And biological and special features component are the most important in this evaluation. And the reason for that is, to not get into a huge breakdown of how you do an evaluation, you're looking for, it's out of 1,000 points, and you're looking for 600 points or more. But if you have 200 points in either of these categories, it automatically qualifies as a provincially significant wetland. And something like a threatened species at risk gives you 150 points. So as soon as you have one, or basically if you have 2 species at risk on the property, it becomes a provincially significant wetland. So these species at risk, we have a bunch of different ones. Most of these were taken on the properties that we manage. This is an ebony bog haunter, which is a gorgeous dragonfly. I only was able to identify this because I took a picture of it. My dragonfly identification wasn't that good. But this is specific to these kind of swampy mossy areas. So there's in total less than 100 populations of these in Ontario, in all of Ontario right now. So it's a very sensitive dragonfly species and very specific to wetlands. It doesn't breed anywhere else. Then we have things like Canada warbler. And I wish I had a closer photo, but this was a photo taken on the same property as this ebony bog haunter, probably about 20 minutes later. And they're a warbler species that traditionally breeds in the boreal, but will breed in Muskoka. And they're specific to kind of swampy areas. So a swamp thicket, or like a spruce, or like balsam fir swamp. So this one I found in, I believe it was a black spruce swamp, and it was nesting. So we have breeding records of that one on one of our properties. Some other ones are spotted turtle, critically endangered, probably 20,000, or it's 2,000 individuals in Ontario. Most of them are taken due to the pet trade. So they're taken because people want a pet spotted turtle, and you can sell them for a lot of money. So if you were to ever find one of these, you would tell no one except maybe a local land trust, or the MNRF. And you can see on this turtle, it's got these little spots on it. That would be why it's called spotted turtle. And these spots are yellow in color. So it's basically a turtle with a bunch of yellow spots on it. And you can see this right here, these kind of patches, those are damage from predators. So this would have been something trying to eat it. So I found this spotted turtle, and I can't tell you where, but I found it. And I never thought I would see one in my life because of how endangered they are. And funnily enough, this was the second spotted turtle I saw that year. And I just happened to stumble across 2 spotted turtles in 1 year. Whether I'll see another one, who knows? But they're these gorgeous little turtles. They're probably about the similar size to a painted, but don't get it quite as large. And you see them kind of in sweet fern fens, I would call it. And they've got 2 different wetland types that they use for breeding and overwintering. So they're very habitat specific, which is why we don't see a lot of them. And then we have the Massasauga, which is not strictly a wetland species. You see it in rock barrens, but it's very commonly associated with areas where protected wetlands are. So you'll see these out in Georgian Bay quite often. Our family has a cottage in Georgian Bay, and we see them like every year. But they're also, I believe, a threatened species, and they use the adjoining wetlands, as well as a number of threatened snake species. So they're not strictly a wetland species, but there's something that utilizes them. So to kind of sum up my talk, I wanted to talk about what you can do, because now we know what wetlands are, we know why they're important, but a lot of people are probably like, well, I don't know what I can do to help protect these incredibly important ecosystems. And there's several things you can do. Taking part in citizen science, whether that's Project Protect through the Muskoka Conservancy, or a similar project, the Great Lakes Marsh Monitoring Project, that monitors bird and frog amphibians. And I know some of you that are on this webinar already take part in that. And essentially, it's a way to track populations of sensitive birds and sensitive amphibian species through the years, so we can see how their population is changing. And there is some good news coming out of these projects, in that some frog species are doing better than we thought, which is great to hear. But again, super sensitive species, where cold snaps can do a number on them, and because they absorb water through their skin, are very sensitive to any changes in the water. You can post sightings on iNaturalist and eBird. I love both these sites. I would say for the layperson, iNaturalist is better, because what iNaturalist allows you to do is take a photo of something and let other people ID it for you. So you can take a photo of a wetland plant you have no idea and post it on iNaturalist, and someone else will ID it for you. So I use iNaturalist a lot because my plant identification still needs work, and I'll take photos of sedges I have in the field. I'll take photos of really literally anything I see in the field, and I'll post it and people, other skilled naturalists will actually identify it for you, or at least give you a sense of where to look to identify it. Another helpful thing is monitor wetlands for changes. So often, most people living in Muskoka probably have one or two wetlands that they either walk by or potentially even own. And those wetlands are really key, no matter how big they are. So making sure those wetlands aren't getting changed, that aren't, you know, becoming filled in or destroyed. And then along hand in hand with that is monitor or control for invasives. So this is actually on our property, and this is purple loosestrife. Maybe everyone thought I was like killing a bunch of beautiful flowers, but that's an invasive species. And that was one of the several bushels we kind of pulled off that property. So cutting purple loosestrife or Phragmites are really important for making sure these wetlands stay natural and stay protected. Phragmites being the absolute worst one, really, because what it does is it fills in a wetland, and it turns a wetland, a native wetland, from an area with several different types of native plants to a monoculture of Phragmites. And it's really interesting. Birds, most of our local birds do not nest in Phragmites. I see stands of Phragmites where birds will migrate through, but when I was cutting it last year, I was trying to tally the species that I saw in it, and it was zero. There weren't bugs in the Phragmites. There weren't frogs in the Phragmites. There was nothing but Phragmites. So to Donna, how damaging is Phragmites? Very. If you have it in a wetland that you manage or protect, contact me and it's very, well, it's not easy to remove. It takes a lot of work, but you have to cut it at the lowest point. So you have to cut it either in the water or the closest point you can get, and then leave those cuttings in a garbage bag out in the sun for about 2 weeks, and it'll kill all the seeds. And then you can dump them at Rosewarne or a local landfill. I believe there are some government control programs for Phragmites. I'm not sure how prevalent they are. I know the Georgian Bay has a huge issue with it right now, and they do a lot of control. Some of it might be funded by the government, but we have 1 or 2 properties with Phragmites on it, and we cut it every single year. And it's going to take a while for us to get rid of it, but the alternative is a Phragmites wetland, which is not really much of a wetland. And another interesting thing about Phragmites is after we finished cutting it one day, I turned around and there was a frog where we had cut all the Phragmites. So things were already moving back in as soon as we took it out. So if you have Phragmites in a wetland, get rid of it. So questions. I'll leave the rest of the time for questions if people have questions. I think there was one maybe I saw from Ted already, but you can either raise your hand if you know how to do that, or you can just type it in the chat if you have a question. And Ted's question is, could you talk about birds that nest in wetlands and the effects of fluctuation in water levels? Yes, I probably can. Several birds that nest in wetland, most of our kind of waterfowl, wood ducks, mallards, green-winged teal, herons, all that kind of stuff. And I would say they're unaffected for the most part by water level fluctuations, with the exception of loons and a couple of other species. Because what a lot of birds will do, so wood ducks, for example, are cavity nesters. They nest in cavities of trees, and they're totally unaffected by water level changes. They're up in a cavity. We have, things like herons often have a rookery. They're up in the top of trees. They are unaffected. You get some of the like pied-billed grebe or Virginia rail often will have a mat of vegetation that they nest in, which will change with the water level. So these birds have adapted to water level fluctuations already. So some of them will have floating nests that just float on the top of the water and are secured to like cattails or things like that. Loons being the one tricky one, they usually start nesting late enough that they're unaffected, but often they nest like on a platform or on the shoreline. So they're a little bit more sensitive to it, as if the water level were to suddenly increase a lot, their nest would probably get flooded. But the people have installed things like loon nesting platforms, which is a floating raft that they nest on that won't get flooded. So it'll kind of, it'll raise with the water level changes. Am I available to hire as a certified wetland evaluator? Maybe. Send me a message. Probably not through my work with the Conservancy, but depending on what my time is, potentially. Is the American bittern a threatened species? Not right now. It is sensitive, though. The least bittern is a threatened species. So most of the bitterns you're seeing in America, or sorry, in Canada, are American bitterns. And the very south edge of Muskoka will get least bitterns, so Georgian Bay and south of Gravenhurst. But the American bittern is a sensitive species, but it's not currently at risk. What is the role of beavers in wetlands? Beavers are like wetland creators. They're the wetland architects. So I saw, if you ever walk near Henry Marsh, there's a beaver dam there, and there's a section of the trail that has almost become flooded because the beavers said, there's this little creek that runs through here, we're going to dam it up. And all of a sudden, it was like a whole new beaver pond was created. So beavers are wetland architects. And I would say beavers know what they're doing. So just leave and let be, because there's a really interesting story about a beaver dam. I don't know whether it was broken or what happened to it, but it washed out up in north of Huntsville, and it took out an entire road. The whole road was washed out because of how much water they were holding back. And it just like, it took out the entire road and then flowed down into the Big East River. So beavers are very important in wetland maintenance. And I would say they know what they're doing. You can manage water levels, but be very careful, because the beavers, like, they're already quite skilled at it. And I would say, if you can coexist with the beaver and it's not damaging your property, I would just leave it be, because the wetlands that they create have some really, really interesting ecosystems. You can see turtles start moving in, you can see birds start moving in. And I've got a beaver dam on my property, and we heard the beaver about a week ago when we were doing a frog survey. And before he moved in, it was an area that seasonally got wet and was kind of like a meadow marsh. And now it's got a totally different species composition of plants. The interior is a fen. I'm pretty sure there's rose begonia on there. And if you let them do what they want to do, then you get some really cool results. What do I think of the proposed beaver bylaw in Huntsville? I don't know anything about it, so I don't have any thoughts on that. But if you'd like to send me an email, I'd be happy to look into it. I don't see any other questions. So this is all recorded. I will be posting this on our website hopefully later today. Or tomorrow, and I will send everyone an email that registered with the recording if you'd like to watch it again, or look at a specific part, because I was going too fast, because sometimes I talk really quickly. And I'd be more than happy to answer any questions if people want to email me. I love wetlands. My June is spent in wetlands. That wetland evaluation course I took literally was like 8 hours a day, hip deep in wetlands. And I loved every second of it. So I love exploring wetlands, and I could talk about wetlands all day. So if that's all, I'm going to sign off. Thanks everyone for attending. June is ideal for exploring wetlands. If you'd like to learn more about the work that the Conservancy does, check the website, and you'll have to check there anyways for the recording. And I hope to see everyone in the field. And I hope everyone likes wetlands a little bit more now. Thanks.